Hi everyone, welcome to our workshop on poetry. So we're going to actually be going over how to read poetry right now. I thought this would be a good refresher slash reminder to help you kind of get in the mindset of how to analyze poetry, how that might be different than analyzing fiction and essays and things of this nature. And that way you're kind of in the right framework to actually write poetry. So, this workshop that we're going to be looking at today was adapted from the online writing lab at Purdue, and this PowerPoint kind of goes over the basics in terms of close reading a poem. And so, this is something that you could use not only this week when we're looking at poetry, but next week or anytime you're trying to read poetry in general. And one of the things that I would do is when you're revising poetry is to look at the same sorts of things, meaning that when we're talking about the form of a poem and trying to analyze the form of a poem, this is something that you can do in your own work or with your own work, and same thing with imagery, word choice, so on and so forth. So let's get into it, okay? There's a lot to go through. So the second slide goes over close reading. And so close reading is talking about analysis. And so that means we are being active readers and we're actively looking for things. What are we looking for? Well, we're looking for things like form. And so since we are doing formal poetry this week, you'll notice that the form is really, really important, that you have to have a specific form, or else you are not going to be considered that type of poem, right? A sonnet needs to have certain things in order to be a sonnet. Same thing with the haiku, so on and so forth. Now, when you get into things like craft, meaning, those things can be a little bit more sort of informal and also maybe not as clear. But when we're getting into the form of a poem, there's a real clear delineation between something that's formal and informal, and we're going to be looking at that over the next 2 weeks. So basically, when we're thinking about close reading, we're taking into consideration everything from the author's form to their word choice and thinking about how that might relate to their theme or message. All right. Now, if we kind of skip a little bit down, we look at this slide about tips. So, in terms of tips, reading poetry is going to be different than reading fiction. On average, I would say that most poems are always shorter than the stories you're going to be reading. Like, think back to Poe and compare it with, the poems that we're going to be looking at. They're a lot shorter. However, poetry tends to be a little bit more dense. And so the thing that you can think about is that you might not be able to get the meaning on the first read. So one of the things I would highly recommend is reading it twice. You could also read it out loud. In the age of the internet, most poems, especially if they're famous poems, you can find being read out loud, sometimes by famous actors, depending upon the poem. So I personally, and also the author too, I personally would look for that. I would read it out loud to yourself, then also look at, see if anyone has read it out loud on YouTube or something like this. That way you can hear someone else, see what they're emphasizing, things like that. Overall, when I think about reading poetry out loud, it totally changes the dynamic. What it allows you to hear, like the cadence and the everything just sort of comes alive, I find, when you read poetry out loud, and especially when you hear someone read it. So I would highly, highly recommend to, at the very least, read it out loud. If not, search out it on YouTube or something like this. Another thing to do is when you're thinking about poetry, look for imagery. And so, like in that last bullet point, it says, annotate important words, phrases, sections. That's pretty similar to what you would do with fiction, but here, word choice and imagery are going to be maybe a lot more important in poetry. So we got to be really on the lookout for those sorts of things. All right. So, if you look at this, the way it's structured is there's a couple different steps, kind of going from the general to the specific. So, what I would do when reading poems is look at the different steps and then kind of answer those going in order. So, if you wanted to skip all the way to slide 6 and start there when you're reading your poem, those are good questions to ask yourself. Now, if you look at these questions, like I said, these are the big picture type of questions, right? So, for instance, it's looking at theme, subject. These are the really sort of big, broad things that we want to identify when writing a poem. Also, this is the same thing you would want to do when writing a poem, right? You would want to identify, like, what theme am I working with, that sort of thing. You might have noticed this a couple weeks ago when we were looking at creative nonfiction. We would try to identify the conflict, right? Like, what type of conflict is this? And the same thing here, whenever we are writing, we want to identify things like the theme or our message so that it's not only clear to our reader, but clear to ourselves. So the step 1, those questions are all looking at the big picture sorts of ideas. Now, if we move to slide 9, this is looking more at the form of the poem. So you see that there's a lot of discussion about positive and negative space. So Buffalo Bill by E. Cummings, I think, is a great example of positive versus negative space. You can see how the poem is arranged so that it's creating this negative space in terms of how it looks on the page. And so these sorts of things tell you that the author is trying to emphasize certain ideas, words, or images in the poem. And so on the other hand, you can look at the use of maybe positive space and try to think about, well, why is the author structuring it in this manner? Is it because of the form of the poem that it needs to be this way? That sort of thing. So when you are writing your poem, the same thing can be true when you think about your use of positive versus negative space, and also things like repetition and also punctuation. I think a lot of people believe that when we're talking about poetry, that all the rules of grammar kind of go out the window in terms of punctuation. While punctuation can be a little bit more kind of loosey-goosey, I don't think you want to just totally abandon it unless you have good reason to. Even people like E. Cummings, who, if you look at his poetry, it could seem like he is doing a bunch of crazy things when it comes to grammar. For goodness sakes, the man doesn't even capitalize his name, right? So that's where you want to focus, though, that he is actually very, uses it to his advantage, and it actually has meaning when he does these things, okay? Don't just sort of disregard it for no apparent reason. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, so once we get to step 3, which is on slide 11, we've gone from the big picture stuff like theme to looking at like the positive and negative space, just how it's structured and the repetition of certain images. Now we're going to get into line readings, okay? So, for instance, you can look at stressed and unstressed syllables. This is something that we can talk about maybe later in the week. Identifying stressed and unstressed syllables can be a little daunting. It requires a good ear, and it requires you to kind of practice and read things out loud. Another thing you can think about is, the meter or rhythm of the line, the variations in terms of short, long, that sort of thing. Enjambments, these are when you purposely take a sentence and then break it into the next line. And so these things are just a couple of ideas and devices that you can look for when you're looking at lines in particular. So if you haven't noticed, when I'm reading poetry, I kind of go through this perspective of kind of looking at the big picture stuff, looking at the form, then looking at the specific lines. Okay? Now, if we get to step 4, this is still getting into the nitty gritty. This is getting more toward word choice, right? So you can think about, why does the author pick this word and not another word? Are they trying to make this poem more formal or less formal? Someone like Sherman Alexie writes how you and I might speak to one another. Whereas you read some of the other poetry we're going to be going over, and this is very formal and very sort of buttoned up, right? So word choice, very, very important. Not saying it's not important for fiction, but it's really crucial to kind of look at when we think about poetry. All right, and the last thing is going back to the first thing in a lot of ways, right? So when we're thinking about poetry, we want to come up with a take on it, and we want to think about what it makes us feel, what are we taking away. And so I always think this goes back to theme or the author's message. And so when we're kind of looking at the poem overall, we're trying to articulate what's the main idea that the author is trying to express. And that's where your thesis could come into play. Now, just looking at all this, one of the things you can think is that, yes, this is a little daunting. Another thing is that this is very similar to what you've done with fiction and creative nonfiction. It's just doing using this tool on something that might be a little more obtuse, okay? And so, like I said, all of these things that we've gone over, from the big picture stuff like theme to the very small in terms of line reading and word choice, these are things you should consider when you're writing your own poem. And so if you look at how these next 2 weeks are structured, we're getting into the formal this week and the informal this next week. So these are things you need to look at and consider. And so maybe your word choice changes from this week to next week. Maybe, obviously, the form of your poem is definitely going to change from this week to next week. And then in terms of theme and message, maybe that also changes from this week to next week. One of the big ideas, not just in poetry, but in writing, is this idea of the relationship between the form of something, how something is structured, and the content of something, what it's about, right? So if we're doing formal poetry in this week, does that shape the way that the things you can talk about in terms of it needing to match up, right? Or maybe you're going to make them purposely opposed to one another. Same thing next week. If it's informal, right? Does that mean, if something's free verse, that gives me more leeway to talk about things that are, maybe not as formal, quote unquote, right? So anyway, I know this was a long post, and when I found this workshop, I thought it would be kind of an interesting one, so I kind of adapted it for what we're going to be using in terms of this week. And I thought it would be a good way for us to just talk about how to read poetry, and then, like I've sort of said throughout here, that hopefully it will be something that you can use when writing poetry, and you can kind of, if not writing, but at least revising, so you can kind of go through these steps in your revision process and see the things that you might need to change. Okay? Well, we're almost there. We're halfway at this point. And so if we haven't had a chance to talk one-on-one, if you'd like to do that, I'm still really open and willing. And all you have to do is shoot me an email or call, and we can talk about the work that you're doing right now, and see where this is going, because this is all going to kind of come together at the end. Okay? All right. Well, have a good week, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.